Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and in this video I want to talk about the 5 questions that new needle felters often ask. Now I know this because I'm a relatively new needle felter. I think I've been felting 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional pieces for about a year now, and I'm at that point where I can remember all of my questions, and I'm also at a point where I've done a little bit of research and know some of the answers. So in this video, let's talk a little bit about the basics of needle felting and some of the basic questions you probably have if you're thinking about getting started. So the first thing I want to do is take you over to my little needle felting studio and show you where I work. So this is it. It's just a big desk. And I have my needles and my foam pads over here. Got a couple of little baby sculptures and some 2-dimensional needle felting. So this is what my space looks like. It's not very big, and it's just large enough for me to work on whatever creatures I need to be working on. If I'm going to be wet felting or doing other kinds of felting, I might be working in a different space, but this has been working really well for me. So let's get down to those questions. So when I first started needle felting, I had a few questions, and I'm hoping they're similar to your questions. The first one was about needles. I kept hearing different sizes, different shapes, and it seemed like I needed to use all kinds of different needles to achieve what I wanted to when I was needle felting. But I've done a little bit of research. I've listened to a lot of podcasters and read some tutorials, and it seems like a lot of needle felters, unless they're, and even if they are kind of more on the more professional side of things, tend to go back to the same needle over and over again. A lot of times it's a 38 because it's a kind of all-purpose needle that lets you do a lot of different things. And if they're working on fine work, they might go up to a 40 or a 42. So let's start with the basics here. You don't need lots and lots of needles. In fact, some needle felters will just simply work with a single needle without any kind of holder. They will just work with this needle and they will felt with it, and that's good enough for them. Now, some people say that that's not as great for your hands and your wrists, so it's best to get a holder. There are lots of different holders out there on the market. I've actually gravitated toward these very simple wooden holders. They just have 2 pieces plus the needle, so it's kind of hard to mess them up. It's pretty easy to use them, to change the needle if you break it, and to write on here exactly which needle you're using. Because if you just have random needles laying around and they don't have any kind of color coding on the top, it can be hard to remember which needle is which. So I like just writing very basically, or leaving a little note for myself if it's a pen, what needle I actually have in there. Now I do like these needles. These are pretty cool if you want to use more than one needle. These are just little pen holders. They come with 3 needles, but you can easily pop out. You can take off the top part and you can unscrew them. Most of these unscrews so that you can adjust. And a lot of people recommend actually not using these multi-needle holders with multiple needles because of a bunch of different reasons. But it's actually better if you just take them out and say maybe use 2 needles or even just 1 needle in them. The nice thing is that they function kind of like a pen. So you can, if you're used to holding things like that, it's easy. It's a very easy tool to felt with. Now these are multi-multi. This one has 5. This one has up to, oh my gosh, like 8 different needles, and I've taken a bunch of them out, mostly at Stephanie Metz's suggestion that when you look at the surface area versus the number of needles, she just uses a couple of the needles in these multi-needle holders. So there's lots of different possibilities for needles, needle holders, all that kind of stuff. But like I said, when it comes down to it, what I tend to use are these 2, a 38 and a 40 in a simple wooden holder. Now, one other thing I will say about needles is it can be really confusing when you start to kind of figure out what all these numbers mean. So the lower the number, if you're using a 32, that's kind of a very coarse needle. You would use that for like the beginnings of felting, if you're working on a sculpture with core wool, just trying to really do that rough work at the beginning. So the lower the number, the kind of coarser the needle, the higher the number, the finer the needle. So once you get up to the 40s and 42s, this is for that finishing work that you want to do at the end with your top coat and things like that. So that's the only other thing I'd say about needles. But like I said, most people just end up using 1 or 2 and pretty simple holders. The next question I had as a new needle felter was, how much wool am I going to be using? I'm familiar with wool from spinning and from knitting, you know, so I can kind of gauge my amounts that way. But when it comes to needle felting, things are a little bit different, and it really depends on who you are and what you're doing. So if you're working on a two-dimensional needle felting project and you're setting up the background, you might use a pretty decent amount of wool, you know, if you're setting things up so that you're going to do some wet felting and things like that. But I didn't ever find that I was using that much wool for a two-dimensional piece, in part because I was using a backer. This is just a pre-felted wool backer that I was working on top of. So I didn't really need to create too much of a mesh to hold everything together. I was just working with very small amounts of wool in different places, different colors. And one of the first things I did as a new needle felter was to get a kit. And this was from a wonderful Canadian needle felter. These are some of the wools that were in the kit. And they came basically like this in a box. I've since transferred them to this plastic container, but in a box, and they were just kind of lined up. And the quantities were not great. You can see this is probably about 25 grams maybe for each of these colors that she sent along. And maybe even less actually. I haven't measured it. But it's very small amounts of wool. You're going to be blending it together, making different colors. And I found that that kit that I got that was about this large lasted me for the better part of 6 or 8 months when I was making a bunch of two-dimensional sculptures. Now when it came to three-dimensional sculptures, the game changed just a little bit, because if you're going to make, this one's a relatively small one. This is a little sun conure that's not finished, but I've used some core wool to create his body. If you're going to be creating larger pieces that are three-dimensional, you'll need some core wool, or I make my own bats basically. You know, I take clean wool and I'll put it through the carding machine, create a bat, and then this thing is perfect for using for my core wool if I'm going to make, when I made my dragon or when I was making my cow. And you can see that this is like a 4-ounce amount of wool. It's a good amount of wool. And I would probably go through, depending on the size of the piece, quite a bit of this. But the nice thing about core wool is that it's pretty plain, it's white, it's relatively cheap and easy to get or to make your own if you have raw fleece lying around, hopefully clean raw fleece. But you can use a lot of this to kind of compact and compress down to the size of your three-dimensional sculpture that you need. And then you can use the other more colorful wools and specialty fibers and things like that to do your top coats. So when it comes to how much wool you need, it really depends. Are you doing two-dimensional? Are you doing wet felting? Are you doing three-dimensional sculptural stuff? Yeah, so it's one of those questions that I'm still researching, but I'm trying to get a handle on it. Just like as a knitter or a spinner, I have a sense of how much yarn I need for a sweater or how much fiber I need to spin a skein of yarn. Needle felting is evolving, and I'm learning how much wool I actually need for each project. And I think you will too as you grow. Now the third question I had as a new needle felter was, what surfaces should I be felting on? This is one of those questions that really depends on what you like and how you like to work. So when I first started needle felting, like I said, I picked up a kit, and that kit, move all these tools out of the way, that kit came with a piece of foam. Just a very plain piece of gray foam, pretty stiff to the touch, so not really super flimsy. You can see that it has some weight to it. And this has been a great felting surface, especially for smaller projects. So when I was working on like a little raccoon project, this surface is just, it's the right size, it's just fine. There are even smaller felting surfaces out there. There are larger pieces of foam, but foam is pretty good. The thing about foam to think about is, and this is a lighter colored piece of foam. Some people use the dark foam, it seems like, and the light foam depending on the colors that they're using, because you see the foam can get picked up, little pieces of it from your needle as you're working with your needle in the foam. If you're continually working on this foam over and over again in certain places, you might end up pulling away little chunks of the foam. And if that happens, then those chunks might end up in your sculpture or in your needle felting. So the foam isn't going to last forever, but it's a pretty durable surface. It comes in different sizes, and I just quite like the way that it feels when I'm actually felting on it. The other surface that I've tried is this one that I'm working on here. This is from Living Felt. And it's very similar to what I've got here in a smaller chunk. It's layers of pre-felt kind of mushed together. You can see that they do come apart just a little bit. This is much, much denser to felt on. And it's really great if you're trying to work on smaller pieces. This one I'll use for like tiny leaves of a plant, or when I'm, making these little mushrooms with these little leaves. This really durable hard surface is wonderful for these smaller pieces. And this larger surface is kind of like my big play mat that I use on my entire table. And the nice thing about this is I can bring the foam over if I'm doing something that, requires that. But I still have this big surface to felt on. It's really great if you have larger pieces, like when I was attaching all the hair to my Highland cow, I was using this surface as kind of my backdrop. It's just a nice big surface that's almost as big as my desk that allows me to do both the sculptural projects and two-dimensional felting. When I first started, I was kind of limited to how big my felts could be based on how much foam I had. I had a little bit larger piece of foam than this, obviously, but now I could do a larger two-dimensional piece as well. You can tape out certain areas of this if you want to try to set yourself up with a grid. It's just a nice surface to be working on, so I would recommend both. But the nice thing is, if you're just starting out, you can use this foam. It's pretty cheap, it's pretty easy to get, and it works wonderfully. And I've used it, like I said, for the first 6 or 8 months of felting. This was just great. Easy to clean. You get little fibers on there, you just pop them off. You could use a lint brush. You can just pull them off with your fingers. Same with this one. It needs to be cleaned right now. I need to get my little brush out and brush off some of the Highland cow that's still on there. But that's what I ended up using for surfaces. I'm sure there are other surfaces out there, and I'd love to know a little bit more about them as I get further into my felting journey. All right, the fourth question I had as a new needle felter is, what about all the other tools? One thing I noticed when I started watching other felters is that they seem to have a lot of tools. If they were wet felting, they had a whole complement of wet felting tools. And if they were working on sculptural pieces, they had wire, floral tape, eyeballs, needle nose pliers, pipe cleaners, clay, glue, the whole 9 yards. And I just want to say, you don't have to have any of this stuff to begin with, especially if you're just doing two-dimensional needle felting. You can just forget about all the wire, all the floral tape, all the pipe cleaners, all the needle nose pliers. Really, all you need if you want to get started is a couple of needles, like I said, probably a ruler, a piece of foam, and maybe some scissors, and a little bit of wool. That's what I think of as like my primary kit. If I'm just doing something simple, this is the main kit I would need to make something fun and just keep me occupied. Now, if you want to get involved in all of those other kinds of felting and projects that I was mentioning, sure, you need to get into the wires and the clay and all the eyeballs and everything else. But this can also be just a very simple craft. So don't forget and lose your way when you see all those fancy tools and stuff. If you have wool and a needle, you can needle felt. And I will say the fifth question I had as a new needle felter is, how do you know it's finished? When I first started making my little raccoon, which was one of the first three-dimensional sculptures I ever made, I had no idea how dense the felting needed to be to hold up or to, stay and continue to work. When I was first working on early two-dimensional felting, I didn't understand yet, how much I needed to felt things down to get them to stay. But the longer I've worked on felting, what I've come to realize is that it's really a matter of preference in a lot of cases. So I've seen a lot of two-dimensional felters who will wet felt a background just so that it's really tacked down and stuck and felted and not moving. Like this one has a wet felted background, and then they'll build their other felt on top of that. And some of those needle felters will actually leave some of their wool kind of loose and interesting. There's a few artists that I watch all the time, and they have this way of felting to different levels in their two-dimensional projects to give depth to whatever they're working on. Now, when it comes to three-dimensional stuff, it does seem like, from what I've learned, you do want to have a relatively felted core, right? It's got to, you don't want it to be mushy, because then when you're trying to apply different layers to it, it's not going to work. And it will also just continue to get bigger and bigger than what you've planned for. So you want to get your core wool felted down so that it's stuck together and it's actually, quite quite hard in this center portion of the project. But it takes a little while to get a feel for that. And if I look back at my little raccoon, he's pretty squishy. And that's okay too, because he's just fine. He's hanging in there. He's got a little more fuzz around him than some of my other completed projects. You know, his tail's a little more fuzzy, his face is a little more fuzzy. I like that as part of his character and as part of like the original needle felting I did. And I think it really just depends. So how do you know when it's finished or if it's felted enough? It's a little bit, I'm sure there are some more technical rules out there, but it's a little bit up to the artist to say when it's finished. Now I had planned to stop at 5 questions, but I do have a bonus round for you. And I thought it might be nice to just talk for a minute about inspiration. When I started needle felting, I thought to myself, how does everyone get inspired about the things that they want to needle felt? And the first thing I did was what I usually do with knitting, or what I used to do with knitting, is to get a kit. And I got some 2-dimensional needle felting kits that were wonderful, and they taught me things about how to layer the colors, how to blend the colors, what's the basic kind of structure of the art that you're making. Especially for those of us who didn't end up taking a lot of art classes or composition classes, it can be really helpful to get a kit and to watch someone else's process and think about how it all works for your inspiration as you move on to being able to think of your own kind of work. Now, this guy came from a kit. He was the first 3-dimensional sculpture I did, and this is a kit. Kits are wonderful because they can teach you new things, and you can follow somebody else's techniques and learn a lot about the craft of the art. But I will say early on when I was interested in needle felting, I started looking to my own photographs, and photographs that, this for example is based on a photograph my husband took of our dog, who will appear right here in the foreground, in this grassy meadow right behind one of our barns. And so I took that photograph and I decided to try to translate it into wool. So I think that using your own photographs, you know, looking around outside, finding beautiful sights and learning how to frame them in an interesting way, and then taking those photographs home, maybe even editing them down so that you get exactly the kind of frame that you're looking for, and then translating it to something like a 2-dimensional or a 3-dimensional sculpture can be really fun, great inspiration for needle felting. So as a new needle felter, I don't have all the answers, but the questions that I was asking helped me to look for specific things on YouTube, in books, and in other people's blogs and projects. And I feel like that kind of process of discovery can be really useful. I mean, if you've been following me on this channel a long time, you know that that's one of the things I love to do, is learn and research and find out what other people are doing and listen to all the knowledge that they have. So that's why at the end of this video, I'd like to invite all of the more experienced needle felters to please comment. Let me know what you think about the 5 questions. What answers do you have to them? And if there are other kind of key things about needle felting that you'd like to share with new needle felters who might be watching this video. In the comments description below, I will list a lot of the wonderful needle felters that I have been following and learning from in the last year. So if you're looking for inspiration, those are wonderful people to go to. I think they all have different angles and different ideas about needle felting, and that's what makes this so much fun as a craft. There's a lot going on, just like with knitting or spinning or crocheting or weaving or any of those other crafts. There are plenty of different perspectives and a lot of great inspiration out there in the world, great teachers, lots to learn. So I hope this has helped you, and I hope you will take up needle felting if you haven't already. Even just that little bit of grabbing some wool, a needle, and a surface to work on, you'll find that it can be quite fun, I think. All right, until next time.